Hey everybody, welcome to a special edition of Density and Affordable Housing here with the Greater Cincinnati Homeless Coalition and Affordable Housing Advocates. My name is Dr. Mark. I'm the Director of Education here at the Greater Cincinnati Homeless Coalition, and I'm glad you've taken the time to learn a little bit more about density and affordable housing today. I want to thank everybody at the Homeless Coalition and at Affordable Housing Advocates for helping out with this project. Just to give you a little bit of background, we are going to be talking about codes and what those codes mean and where they came from. So we here in Cincinnati experienced a big displacement in the urban basin during the 1950s and 60s with the interstate highways and eventually urban renewal. And this happened all across the country. So this isn't specifically just here in Cincinnati, but they made claims that we're doing this, we're going to move people out of these slums or high concentrated areas where many families were living together. There wasn't a lot of space to move around. And what we're going to do is we're going to move everybody out. And some excuses were made, like we're doing this for their own good because we want to make sure that people get into better housing. Unfortunately, thousands of people were displaced, including here in Cincinnati and Kenyon-Barr, which is now the West End and Queensgate, where over 26,000 people were removed and over 25,000 of them were African-American people. And because of that, Black people moved all throughout the city and pushing further, migration changes over the years. And what we saw as well at that time was what was called blockbusting, where real estate agents and realtors would come in and to neighborhoods that were Black or that were white and say, hey, Black people are moving in. And encourage them to move out using fear, right? And urban renewal was seen as a solution to a problem of overcrowding, poor housing conditions. But now when we look back on it, we understand that it has created generational issues and specifically have harmed Black families here in Cincinnati and across the country. So we are fortunate that we offer several educational opportunities at the Homeless Coalition in partnership with AHA, including our housing protections, which we talk about the history of housing in America and in Cincinnati, where we understand it from a position where white folks have benefited while Black folks have been purposely cut out and have lost out on housing and generational wealth through housing. Another thing I would encourage you all to do is check out our tours, our walking tours. We have virtual and in-person tours, and we will be doing some of those in November as well, open to the public, pay what you can, where we go through and we talk about the history of redlining and all that kind of stuff. So please check those out. So who benefited from urban renewal? Well, not Black people, right? So the social structures were uprooted, people were flung from their homes, and there was loss of ownership of just even properties, but also of communities itself. And people were pushed away from the core services, which led to more dependence on things like transportation. And this also was coupled with the exclusion of Black families from the Homeownership Loan Corporation, those loans that were given between 1932, 1934 to about 1970. And so this urban renewal was really only to benefit the white people who had moved to the suburbs utilizing those loans. And this was also at the same time at the end of the Great Migration, and which was people coming up from the South, trying to seek out freedom from, 1900, 1970. So do the tours because we talk more about it there. And it's much more interesting if you get the whole background to that. But this is what basically led to these codes, right? So these, whether that be on housing or businesses or transportation, right? These codes started to pop up, and a lot of them were single family homes, right? So single family zones where there were single family zoned, and those also had, issues as well. So we could go into that. You have to do the tours, you have to do the trainings to get really deep into that, because today we're just focusing on density and affordable housing. So firstly, when we're talking about density, we're talking about how many people are like living in the same property or in the same building. And so for an example here, it's basically within the building's footprint. So how many people could live in this building? So down the street here and over the Rhine, there was a building that in 2009 had 33 people living in it, right? It was an SRO and it was more dense, right? It had a pretty strong density. Well, today there's about 6 people living in that building, right? So in the same building that 10 years ago had 33 people, we have 6 people, so it's less dense. And that's the kind of density we're talking about. How many units can you build on a footprint on a property, right? And you could also think about density within like a neighborhood or a city or a county, and where people are. And so if you look at this map down here, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, you can see this is race, individuals where they live by race in Cincinnati. And the red dots represent white people, the blue dots represent Black people. And you can see kind of patterns of, this is the downtown area here. You can see the bend in the river where no one lives. And you can see there are definitely segregated neighborhoods here in Cincinnati. So when we're talking about affordability today, we have 2 options as well. We could talk about affordable for a household, so that the household is paying no more than 30% of their income towards their housing, including their utilities. Or we can think about affordability in that area too. So can people who live in this area, in this neighborhood, can they afford the rents that are being presented there? And that is the kind of affordability we're thinking about today. And the way that we think about affordability in a area or region is by AMI, area median income. And what that does is it lines everybody up. And you should definitely do the Affordable Housing 201, because we go in this in 201, we talk about how to calculate affordability in an area. But the area median income in Cincinnati is about $35,000 a year per household. So for $35,000 a year, if you make $35,000 a year, is there a household or an apartment that's available for you to rent? That you can afford, where you're not paying more than 30% of your income. So today we're going to be talking more about affordable, meaning that it's 60% AMI or less. So you might be hearing them talk about density in the different reports that are coming out. The federal government just put out this fact sheet last week that's talking about how to increase supplies of affordable housing, and they give different ideas about how to do loan programs and how to work those out, how to booster the LIHTC program, which is the largest program that creates affordable housing here in the United States. And one thing that they also point out is that in here, it says 1 out of every 6 homes in America is being bought by an investor, which means that there are fewer options for owner-occupied buildings. And so that's an issue that we talked about in our last video about hedge funds and affordable housing. So make sure you check that out on our YouTube page or on our Facebook, because we did a great video about hedge funds as well, and how international investors are buying up properties, and what that means to specifically Generation Z, people about 25 years and younger, which is the largest generation of people buying houses. So check out the hedge fund video, because we definitely go in depth on that. So one of the things that they also talk about is how to reduce exclusionary zoning. So that is the kind of zoning that would say, hey, it's single family, so you can't have accessory units, you can't have other multifamilies in those areas, and looking about changing those policies. So the federal government is looking to have conversations about this, these listening, learning and listening sessions, the White House and HUD and other folks getting together to do that. So we're going to be hearing more about density and affordable housing as we're coming up here in the future. Here in the city of Cincinnati, we are have been hearing about changing our zones, and for a while, our multifamily density regulations, getting rid of those so that people could build more units on a single footprint. We've also had the city manager's recommendations on affordable housing that came out earlier this year, and there's currently pending council legislation or going through committees about removing the multifamily density regulations. So this is on people's tongues, they're talking about it, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this today. So we're going to go through each of these really quickly and talk about them each. So the city claims that density can bring in economic and environmental sustainability, historic preservation, and small business development. We're not really focusing much on that, but one of their other claims is on housing affordability. So this is what we're going to try to examine today in this presentation. So the city in their presentation, they look at it like this. This is the example that they give. They say, look, on the left here, you can see this square, and it says $10,000 per month that it would cost to keep this this building or this unit alive, right? This building, it's on a footprint, right? So this footprint alive. So that's paying the mortgage, that's insurance, that, you know, whether you're putting away for your capital expenditures, all that kind of stuff, right? So they're saying it costs $10,000 a month, your construction costs. Well, if you split that one building into 4 units, each unit could shoulder the burden at $2,500 a month. And if those regulations were removed where they didn't have to have so many square footage, like these big apartments, and they could do 9 apartments in that same building, then each apartment would only be responsible for about $1,000 each. So this is what the city's model is based upon. But we know in reality that these will still go for market rate. So they might not be affordable for 0 to 60% AMI. In fact, that's what that means. Anything over 60% AMI is what's called market rate, whether we call it workforce housing or whatever, that is market rate. So we know that this would still follow in the market. So if the market was $1,400 studios, just because they're smaller, they would still charge that, right? So immediately, if they change these zones so that people can have remove the square footage requirements for their properties, and they could build more units on those properties, the value of that property would immediately go up. And because of that, we know that it would just benefit this market rate, so over 60% AMI. So the city manager put out these affordable housing recommendations after we were organizing, or there was organizing, against Elm and Liberty. So that was back, it's been going on for a couple years, and there was a property that is being built. It's 2 different properties now, and they're putting in about 300 units, and they're all market rate units, and people in the community wanted to have some affordable units in the property because it's right across from the FC Cincinnati Stadium. So a $350 million investment right across the street. So they know that it's a pretty safe investment. So the community council and other folks in Over the Rhine said, hey, we would like this to have affordable housing in it. Well, the developer was very clear and said, hey, we built affordable housing in the past, but we're not doing that anymore. We want this to be market rate. And the developer got every variance it needed. In fact, it got a density variance, it got public land, height variances, whatever you could think of, that project was granted that. So after that went through and it was approved, it still hasn't been built yet, but after that was approved, one of the council members erroneously said if they could have had more density, they would have created affordable housing. But the fact remained is they never intended to have affordable housing. So we will, be able to talk about this. And I encourage people to do the trainings as well, because those provide more background information. So the city manager put out recommendations about affordable housing. So what does that mean? Well, the city manager is basically the boss of the city of Cincinnati. It's not the mayor, it's the city manager. And we changed the boss from the mayor because when the mayor was the boss, they were doing kind of shady things because they could hire and fire the police and all that kind of stuff. So several years ago, the city of Cincinnati made this thing where the city manager is the boss. And so the city manager, when they make recommendations, the rest of the city is supposed to listen to that. So these recommendations came out earlier this year, and they came out partially because a city council member asked for some information about this. So one of the things they also wanted to know was how much money was in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, right? Because we have an Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So the city manager had some basic assumptions in their report. One of them was that affordability is simply about supply and demand. And we know that that is not true, right? That we know that housing costs are variable based upon what people are willing to pay, what that market looks like, what's hot, where are people going. And we also know that the supply and demand piece doesn't really kick in until we have enough housing. And right now we're 40,000 units short in our county. So that means that there are 40,000 households paying more than 30% of their income towards their housing. And until that shortage, until nobody is paying more than 30% of their income towards their housing and everybody has a place to live, supply and demand is just a theory. So when you hear them talk about supply and demand, just understand that that's a theory and does not directly relate to affordability because there's other factors in play, and including racism, right, and anti-Black racism and how that affects people's housing options, right? And another assumption is affordable means paying no more than 30% of your income towards your housing, which is true. But the thing about it is that there is a lack of housing for people making up to about $50,000 a year. That's much greater than a lack of housing for people making over $50,000 a year, right? So we need to prioritize where the need is and the people who need it the most. And the city said it had two roles. One, it can do regulation. So that's the things we're talking about today, right? Like the zoning and stuff like that. And then they can also provide incentives. So just like I was just talking about, they can give out public land. They can allow your building to get bigger. They can give you direct money, right? They can finance some certain things. And so they are able to provide those incentives and funnel some federal money as well and other sources of money. The city already provides some home ownership benefits by doing like repairs and down payments for single family homes. And those are at people at 80% AMI. So that's not affordable. Again, 60% and below is affordable housing. And then they also do the NOFA program, which is how the city does affordable housing. They basically work with other work with developers who have LIHTC grants, which are funds, which is the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Fund, which is the biggest way that housing is funded. Affordable housing is formed from the federal and state level. And so that year the city claimed that they spent about $12 million, and most of that was federal money, not our money. And with that $12 million, they created 700, it says facilitated the creation of over 700 units of affordable housing. So they were taking credit for what other people were doing, spending 1 to 3% on a project and saying, well, we created that, right? So they gave money at the end, gap financing at the end of these projects, and then take credit for it, right? So that was kind of a questionable claim that the city made. And they also made this claim that private and public partnerships are necessary. Again, this is their basic assumptions and their claims. I'm not saying any of this is true or any of it's false, but that's what the city wanted to do. So they also made a recommendation that there be a housing advisory board that's picked by the mayor, and they would be full of lenders, builders, developers, real estate brokers, some residents that are eligible for housing, CMHA, like the board or people that work there, council members, and anyone else would be on this housing advisory board, and they would develop the affordable housing priorities. Now, the affordable housing priorities are one of the most important things to be thinking about right now, because that is where the money going into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, that is how they will be spent. So until we have this housing advisory board, we cannot spend any money in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. There's a couple other pieces that the city put out in the recommendations, is that they would do a Section 108 loan pool again, which is a federal loan pool where they can spend it on anything. They can put it on parking garages and luxury housing. And they had a big press conference and said, we're going to do this loan pool, which is great, and it has done some things in the past, but none of it is actually guaranteed to 0 to 60% AMI. And that's the big issue with that. So the other thing is the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, the recommendations were to consolidate it, leverage some private funding, offer some loans that could be forgivable, work with the port and some other folks, and they did not account for the current amount in the trust fund, which is kind of weird looking back. I was like, no one said how much is in the trust fund. And then they said we should leverage city investment to fundraise from private parties. So they said we're going to raise 30, 35 million from private parties. And then we would want to legislatively streamline housing production. And that is where what we're talking about today comes in. So you just got a little snapshot about those recommendations. But at the very end, they said we want to change the zoning rules so that we can make, and other rules so that we can make more housing more affordable. So they essentially said we're not going to create affordable housing, but what if we change some of the requirements and the density restrictions in different areas so that we could have more affordable housing? So that when that happened, that report was released. It was released just after we had people in the community, the Homeless Coalition, AHA, Mark, and other folks had got together and submitted a petition to change the charter of the City of Cincinnati to ensure that at least $50 million a year would go to affordable housing at 0 to 60% AMI. And when we submitted that back in February, when this came out in March, it had some of the same trappings and some of the same thoughts of our charter amendment. So like the Housing Advisory Board, and you should also know that we helped create the Affordable Housing Trust Fund as it is, even though no money's come out of it. We helped create that trust fund back in 2018. So there's a certain form to that trust fund, right? There has to be a board that directs where that money goes. So our plan dedicated funding towards affordable housing, so 0 to 60% AMI, 30% had to be, 50% had to be 0 to 30% AMI. The other 50% could be spent anywhere, up to 60% AMI. We also had just cause eviction protection so that people would have housing protections. Livable wages were guaranteed in the work. Obviously, prevailing wages that would make sense as well, right? So that people would get the wage that they deserved, no matter what, livable and up higher. That it was equity focused, right? So that it would focus on who needs it the most versus where do we think that this is economically the most feasible. Community controlled board, and those units would remain affordable forever, right? So that was our plan when issue 3 came out last spring or last fall. And then the city's response was, we're not going to dedicate any funding towards affordable housing. We're not going to have any housing protections. We're not going to make sure there's livable wages beyond what the city already requires. We're going to focus on trickle-down housing. So we're going to say if we build luxury housing and market rate housing, that will somehow decrease the cost of other people's housing. We're going to make sure the mayor controls the board. And we're maybe going to say things have to be affordable for 10 years, right? So bringing us up to this summer, Councilmember Keating came out and said, look, there's a bunch of different places, different zones, and if we change those zones so that they don't have a square foot minimum, then they will be able to build more units in there. So these different zones like multifamily, office, commercial, urban mix, manufacturing, riverfront zoning district have limits on how much square footage you need to have per unit, right? So this would get rid of that limit. So these different zoning districts, there's several of them, and you can see like one, it's like residential multifamily 2.0. Well, if you look over here, that 2.0 means basically 2,000 square feet have to be each unit. So each unit has to be 2,000 square feet. 1.2 means 1,200 square feet. 700 is a multifamily 0.7. And so if you think about a 700 square foot, that's basically like a 1 bedroom. 1,200, you're kind of getting into 2 bedrooms. 2,000, definitely 2 bedroom. 2,500, maybe like 3 bedroom or more, right? Or, et cetera. So this is what it currently stands, right? So our zoning has these different per unit restrictions on the unit, right? A per unit density restriction or square footage restriction, you know what I mean? So, but the city already gives out these variances, what's called a variance. And if a developer wants a variance because they want to have smaller units than is allowed by the zone, theoretically, they're supposed to go to the community council and get a letter of support. But ultimately, that variance is granted by the city and is something that is granted all the time, right? Developers, it's just part of the process of doing that, right? So we already grant variances beyond these restrictions, okay? So when I took each of those zones that we just saw, the or multifamily and all that kind of stuff, and I put them in CAGIS. And on CAGIS, they have a zoning map that you can go onto, and there's links in the description, supposedly. There should be links, maybe not. We'll get the links in the description. But you can go to CAGIS, and they have a zoning map, and you can put in all the different zones, and then it'll put those on the map. So that's what I did. So these are all the areas in Cincinnati in blue that would be affected by this zoning change that is in front of City Council right now. And if you look at it, something that you'll notice is that, like, Lunken Airport's down here. I would kind of ignore that, right? This big blue dot down here. But if you focus here where Over the Rhine is in the West End, you can see up here in Coreyville, all the way up to Avondale, parts of Walnut Hills, right? You know, these historically Black neighborhoods. And I looked at this map and I thought back to that map I showed at the very beginning. And so if you're just catching up, you know, hopefully you'll go back and watch this from the beginning. The map of the white and Black people in Cincinnati. And so if you look on the left here, very left, you can see that map I just showed you of these zones that are proposed to be changed. And on the right, you can see in blue is where Black people live in Cincinnati. And if you superimpose these two on top of each other, you can see that those zones almost completely line up with where Black people live in Cincinnati. Now, that is because of generations of displacement that have been happening in Cincinnati. This is because of urban renewal, and that Black people were forced into these arterial areas where they have multifamily houses along the main roads. You have neighborhoods that were segregated by white generational wealth that was given the opportunity to build that through our federal governmental policies that excluded Black people specifically from that, right? And so when you put these two maps on top of each other, you can see that this zoning change disproportionately affects Black people in the city of Cincinnati, but the city has not said anything about that, right? They're not focused on equity and race. They're looking at value, because as soon as this zoning changes, right? Because when developers come to community council, they come to get a zoning change, or they go to city council to get that zoning change because it adds value to the property, right? So when we look at those two, and you can kind of see it changing here, but when you look at them, you can kind of see those changes. So this should be available at some point for you to check out. So if we look at closer in, like Over the Rhine and the West End, you can see that this proposed zoning change affects most of this neighborhood, right? You can see, except along like Central Parkway and a couple other places, you can see in Mount Auburn, the zoning change would affect that all the way up in here into Walnut Hills, right? This is Walnut Hills coming all the way up in the hill here. But one thing I noticed is that Walnut Hills, there's this big hole in the business district that is would not be affected by these code changes. So that is because Walnut Hills, along with Madisonville, and maybe a couple other places, adopted form-based code. So form-based code is kind of in the same realm. We're talking about zoning changes, code changes. Instead of looking at a building, how it is used, the form-based code looks at a building, how it fits in the fabric of the neighborhood, right? So that change happened in Walnut Hills some years back, and that is to kind of respond to, and you'll notice it's around the business district. So it's in between McMillan and Taft, and it's along Gilbert, right? And this form-based code had been adopted there as well. So the proposed zoning does not affect single family homes at all in Cincinnati. So if you live in a single family home or you're in a single family home area, this doesn't affect that. This is, most of Cincinnati is single family except for along the major roads in historic districts and in the urban basin, right? So this single family home is, different from like residential zoning, right? Because you have residential multifamily. And I really do believe if they tried to change the single family zoning, it would be heavy lifting, right? And we'll talk here in a second about what that kind of means. So like, what is the city trying to do, right? So it looks like they're trying to change the zoning where a bunch of Black folks live in the city of Cincinnati who are already feeling the pressure of gentrification, of outside investors, coming in, buying 2,000 units, just one investor alone last year, international investor coming in, pushing people out of their homes. We want to know, why is the city not working harder to protect people in their homes, right? But their constant excuse to why they do this is that it brings in that international, that out-of-town investment, right, that we desperately need, right, that it brings in more market rate and luxury housing, which increases the earning tax. And the earning tax is the major way that the city of Cincinnati gets its money, right? But their theories of supply and demand, their basic assumptions, doesn't consider anti-Black racism. It doesn't consider housing trends, gentrification. It doesn't consider the white suburban wealth that is forcing itself into historically Black neighborhoods. It doesn't look at how we as a city provide corporate welfare to the developers, to other businesses, and those that they need, right? So it doesn't, supply and demand doesn't take that into consideration. And the authors that the city has used in their documentation have written books on making preschool profitable and how businesses can get as much corporate welfare as possible. How can they get as much out of local and other governments? And they even refute the existence of racism in housing, just ignore it altogether, and pretend that it's something in the past, right? And ultimately, what the city is doing does not focus on the need, right? So the need is for 0 to 60% AMI. That's where we have tens of thousands of families that are struggling to pay their bills, to make rent on time, to put food on the table, to get their medicine, to do transportation, all those costs, right? They're paying more than 30% of their income towards their housing. And unfortunately, the city manager has said, we don't believe that deeply affordable units are even possible. And essentially, we're not even going to put that on our target, because things like the Section 108 loan pool, they can use that to build businesses and parking garages and say, well, it benefits people at a certain economic level, right, as workers or something like that, right? So there's ways that they can say, this is beneficial, but it does not have to create affordable housing. So again, just kind of reminding you, we didn't really talk about the environment or economic sustainability or historic preservation or small business development, but those are the claims that they were kind of making. So we've seen some unintended consequences almost already. We've seen a loss of community voice. So currently, the density variances should go to community councils. They should weigh in on them. If they change the zoning, that process won't even exist anymore. And we've seen how many times city council has overruled the community council, right? Just time and time again. We've also seen that the city manager's memo on community engagement is trying to reduce the engagement with the communities and give the developers less work to do. In the past, developers were supposed to go to community councils. Now the Department of Planning and Engagement, which just if you blinked, you missed it. The Department of Planning and Engagement was just added this summer. They're the ones that are going to be leading the community meetings around development. So they're going to have nighttime meetings, like one at 5 o'clock yesterday, I believe, about the Logan Street garage that the county is building for FC Cincinnati. That's going to cut off Logan Street, or cut off Logan Street. Yeah. It's going to cut the whole street off altogether. And there are other considerations of why we think that the city manager and the city is doing less community engagement, right? So they put it on this Department of Planning, and now they're going to do the input sessions. But you can check out the webpage, the city webpage, go to the Department of Planning and Engagement, and check out their community meeting schedules. They have past meetings, they have different schematics on different projects and stuff on that. And then ultimately, if we remove this zoning, it could lose those lost family housing. So instead of there being a 3-bedroom, now that's 3 or 4 studio apartments, or that's 3 or 4 efficiencies, right? And so families are having less and less options for places to live. We're seeing so many houses turned, or units turned into smaller units, and that family housing is being lost, right? So we got to keep that in mind. And if single family zoning regulations were removed, just as an example, this is not what's being proposed. But what we would see is something very similar, that people with capital and with wealth would be able to really thrive with those. So they could build their granny shacks, right? So you might have multi-generational people living in High Park and Mount Lookout and Oakley and stuff, because they're building these accessory units, these auxiliary units to their homes, which could be a good thing, right? You want to have, those granny shacks out there, right? Because they're important parts of our community. And you'd also see Airbnb grow, where they'd be buying out houses for Airbnb and then splitting them up. And we would see more displacement of Black folks out of historically Black neighborhoods, regardless if it was just single family zoning or not. If this ultimately privileges capital and people who have active income to put towards housing for long-term investment, so like adding a new unit to your house could create an investment opportunity, so you could get rent for a long time, or have your kids live there. Again, maybe it could be a multi-generational thing, and likely you get complaints from the neighbors, right? Because there have, in my research here, I guess there's one side that says, renters are bad for communities. Those folks would definitely start complaining if you change that character of the neighborhood. But what does the removal of density not do? Like those regulations, right? So again, this is looking at, you have a footprint of a building. Each unit has to have a certain amount of square footage in it. If we made it so you don't have to have a certain amount of square footage, or it could drop down to like 500 feet per unit, what would that not do, right? And one thing it would not do is create a more environmentally friendly community. That was one of the claims of the city said. And that is because unless we have specific regulations regarding energy use and building supplies, and other greenhouse gas concerns, that's not going to change things, because people are still reliant on automobiles, especially here in Cincinnati, and especially in white neighborhoods, people who drive every day. And it also doesn't ensure clean water and air. It doesn't, ensure that people have access to healthcare, of course, all those types of things. And we know that Black people in Cincinnati are most affected by environmental racism, less trees in your neighborhood, bad water, bad air right next to highways, all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, removing density regulations does not ensure affordability, period. And that is because we need specific regulations, including deed restrictions. So meaning that a deed would be restricted to stay affordable for a certain amount of time at a certain level, right? And that it would be at 0 to 60% AMI. Without an insurance policy or something that demands that, it's not happening. It's not going to happen. And it doesn't address, the concerns about segregation and housing discrimination, right? So Black people are still going to face more obstacles in finding housing, especially affordable housing. And because the gap in affordable housing is so great right now, over 40,000 units just in our county, we are going to continue to have people who are paying more than 30% of their income towards their housing, which is unacceptable. So ultimately, without having specific regulations, removing density regulations does not create affordability. So there is a better approach, right? We can do this better by looking at the tools that we have. So the equitable development rubric of the Peasley Neighborhood Center, check that out, right? This talks about that community input process, a 3-month process that developers should go through with their community council before building anything. A 3-month community-led community input process. That is the responsibility of the developer to facilitate, by the way. There are tools for community councils in the equitable development rubric, and it is equity focused, right? Making sure that people in the community who are most vulnerable receive the most support that they need. And we need to make sure that we get control, community control of the Housing Advisory Board. So currently the mayor can pick people to be on that board. The mayor has not picked anybody for the board. But whoever is going to be on that board is going to come up with those priorities for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And those priorities will direct where the money is going. So we have to make sure that we get community control of the Housing Advisory Board. We also have to make sure we have those affordability contracts. I put 15 years down here, and that's just because that's the basic LIHTC length for those contracts. So a couple other things that we need to think about. You know, it's not just density that's important, right? It is that people have less health barriers based upon the environment around them. That there are places for people to go that will make sure that people have healthy lives, and removing food deserts, right? You know, looking at how Black residents, specifically in the city of Cincinnati, how the support is needed and how they can be supported most. We also need to make sure we have housing protections, right? So housing court, which would have tenants and landlords on it together, do mediation so that it doesn't just end up as an eviction on your record forever, right? Things like pay to stay policies, meaning that if somebody has the rent and they can pay it, that would be considered a defense in court, right? That's very important as well. And we can even look at things like rent control and proactive measures, and making sure that people have access to affordable housing, which we do not now, right? And that there are livable and prevailing wage agreements and all the projects that are done. And of course, a lot of this, literally all this stuff, is part of that equitable development rubric. So what we need to make sure that we're always considering is, how does this proposal in a city that is over 40% Black, how does this proposal affect Black people, right? How does it affect the families, you know, multiple, with multiple kids, right, that want to have multiple bedrooms in an apartment, right? How does this affect people who are on low incomes or fixed incomes, or elderly folks who are, you know, needing to age in place? How does this affect Black home ownership, right? These are the questions that we need to make sure we ask the city before they move forward with the removal of these density requirements. Because if it just privileges capital, and in this area, the white generational wealth that has grown in the suburbs is immense. It's unimaginable how much money there is, right? So if this just privileges that capital and allows people with capital to really engorge themselves on this, then we have to question, is this going to create more displacement? Is this going to further both direct and indirect gentrification, right? And so there are ways that you can get involved. So with our education program, we have our tours, our speakers, our trainings. I know some of you have done some of them here in the comments. I appreciate your comments here. And I encourage you to do that in November. Again, we're going to be doing some more for our Homelessness Awareness Week and Homelessness Awareness Month in November. So we'll be doing those. So look out for those, or pay what you can. We'll have in-person tours here in Cincinnati. So if you're in Cincinnati and you want to learn more, come on, take the tours, because you can sign up on our website, cincyhomeless.org. You can also make sure you're picking up a Street Vibes. You can see a couple behind me up there. Those are a community newspaper. And make sure you're supporting the distributors. It's an alternative to panhandling, but then also there's great information in it. I've got articles in there, check those out. Leading up to my book, it's coming out in November as well. called Steal the Street. You have to check that one out. Also, make sure you're following Cincinnati Action for Housing Now. And you can also join the Homeless Coalition and AHA. So if you go to our website, which is cincyhomeless.org, you can see different information about what's going on with the moratorium, what kind of offerings we have and stuff like that. But you can also scroll down and learn more about our advocacy and our organizing that we do. So we work with tenants to help create and sustain tenant organizations, and that help fight back against landlords and property management that are often doing illegal and unjust things. So make sure you want to check us out there. You can also check out link to Street Vibes. There is a digital version of it, so you can check out Street Vibes, check out my different articles. The one that just went live yesterday of mine is Out with the Old, In with the Few. And, I'd suggest checking that out on cincystreetvibes.com. And then our education program, as we talked about before, we have speakers, tours, trainings. You can earn your ambassador certificate. You can learn more about that, of course, by going to our website at cincyhomeless.org. And then if you would like to become a member of the Homeless Coalition, you as an individual can become a member. We also have memberships for organizations. So if your organization wants to join the Homeless Coalition, we would love to have you. Right now, we are made up of advocacy organizations, direct service organizations, religious organizations. Anyone who believes that we can end homelessness should be a part of the Homeless Coalition. So you can also go to our website, check out some videos, learn more about what we do at the Homeless Coalition here in Cincinnati. So I do want to thank everybody for coming out for this presentation today. I will put these links in the description. So when you're watching this, maybe you're watching this later, we do have all the links to the different maps, how you generated them. If you're interested in that, when I was talking about CAGIS and all that kind of stuff, you can just click on the link and it'll have the pre-populated map on there for you. So thank you all. We really appreciate you coming today, and I hope everyone has a great day. And thanks for listening to me talk about density and affordable housing. I want to thank once again the Homeless Coalition team. I want to give a big thanks to Mona Jenkins for bringing this topic up and really putting it out there so we could learn more about it. I want to thank Affordable Housing Advocates, and I want to thank you, the viewer at home, for taking the time, for watching this today, for joining me today. It just made me feel so much better to see you, everybody here. And I will put the links out. And just remember, you matter, and have a great day. Bye.